8-year-old Ethan Carter used to be the boy who filled every room with laughter. But the day his mother died, that laughter vanished, replaced by silence, sharp words, and a stubborn distance no one could cross. Once curious and gentle, Ethan now pushed people away, his small shoulders carrying a weight far too heavy for his age. His father, Daniel Carter, was a young tech billionaire who could solve billion-dollar crises with a single phone call, but was powerless when it came to mending the rift with his own son. Daniel buried himself in work, convincing himself that providing everything money could buy was enough. In reality, each late night at the office was another brick in the wall between them. The mansion they lived in, with its marble floors and glass walls, felt more like a cold museum than a home. Ethan would disappear into corners, avoiding eye contact, while Daniel would linger in doorways, wanting to say something but never finding the right words. Grief had turned them into strangers, living under the same roof, each silently hoping the other would make the first move, but neither knowing how. It wasn't just the loss of a mother and wife that haunted them, it was the slow erosion of connection, the fear that the love they once shared had slipped away for good. And unless something or someone stepped in to bridge that growing chasm, the distance between father and son might soon become permanent. When Grace Mitchell first stepped through the towering oak doors of the Carter estate, she thought she had been hired for nothing more than the practical duties of keeping the sprawling mansion in order. Her listed years of experience managing large households, but no line on any piece of paper could have prepared her for the quiet storm she was about to walk into. The house was immaculate in the way expensive homes often are: gleaming surfaces, polished silver, a silence that clung to every wall. But beneath that perfection lay an emptiness, an air so heavy, it seemed to press down on her shoulders the moment she crossed the threshold. And in the midst of it all was Ethan Carter, the 8-year-old boy whose wary eyes followed her every move that first day. Ethan did not speak to her. He didn't greet her or ask who she was. Instead, he sat curled up on the wide window seat in the front hall, his small hands clutching the edge of a book he wasn't reading. The boy's posture was closed, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. Grace recognized that look. It was the same look she had once seen in the mirror as a child, after losing her own mother. It was the expression of someone trying to keep the world out. Grace approached her role with quiet observation at first, respecting the invisible boundaries Ethan had set. She dusted the shelves, straightened the framed photographs, and prepared meals, all while noting how Ethan's father, Daniel, seemed to pass his son like one might pass a stranger in a hotel lobby. Brief nods, no lingering words. The air between father and son was brittle, stretched thin by grief neither knew how to share. It was during her second week that Grace noticed the fading bruise on Ethan's cheek. He'd tried to hide it by keeping his head turned, but when she caught sight of it, something inside her shifted. She didn't press for details. Instead, she fetched a clean cloth, knelt beside him, and dabbed gently at a small scrape on his forehead. "You're brave," she said softly, her voice low enough to be just between them. "I'll take care of you, the way your mom did." For a moment, Ethan's eyes flickered, something fragile breaking through his guarded expression. He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. That small allowance was enough for Grace to know she had been given a rare opening. From that day forward, her presence became more than background noise in the Carter household. She began weaving subtle threads of connection into Ethan's daily life. At breakfast, she would slide a plate toward him with a quiet good morning. No expectation of reply. In the afternoons, she'd leave a glass of chocolate milk by the window seat where he liked to sit, a silent offering of comfort. Grace also noticed the boy's eyes linger on the family photographs in the hallway, images of Paulers. Ethan with his mother, their smiles unforced and radiant. One evening, she stopped dusting and simply stood with him in front of one of those frames. "She loved you very much," Grace murmured. "And love like that, it doesn't disappear." Ethan's lips trembled, but he stayed rooted beside her, absorbing the words as if they were something he hadn't heard in a long time. It wasn't long before the mansion's sterile silence began to shift. Grace's laughter, soft and unassuming, would sometimes drift from the kitchen when she found something amusing in the newspaper comics. Ethan, pretending to be uninterested, would hover nearby just long enough to hear it. And on rare days, when the sunlight streamed through the windows just right, she'd catch him watching her with a look that wasn't suspicion anymore, but curiosity. She never forced conversation. Grace understood that healing wasn't about prying open locked doors. It was about waiting patiently until the person inside decided to open them. Her patience paid off the evening. Ethan finally spoke more than a handful of words to her. She had been helping him bandage a small cut on his hand after a tumble in the garden. It hurts, he admitted quietly. I know, Grace said, her tone calm and steady. But you're safe now. Safe. The word seemed to echo in the stillness between them. Grace noticed his shoulders relax ever so slightly. In that moment, she became more than an employee, she became a refuge. Daniel noticed the change, though he didn't say it out loud. He would come home late to find Ethan at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, working through homework while Grace sat nearby, offering quiet encouragement. Sometimes he'd hear Ethan laugh, a sound so rare it caught him off guard. It stirred something complicated in him, gratitude, jealousy, and guilt tangled together. But Grace never claimed a role that wasn't hers to take. She didn't try to replace Ethan's mother. Instead, she honored her memory in the way she cared for the boy, acknowledging his pain, rather than trying to erase it. She knew the space left by loss could never be filled, but it could be softened, warmed by the steady presence of someone who refused to turn away. One rainy afternoon, as the wind rattled the windows, Ethan brought her a crumpled piece of paper. On it was a simple drawing. 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Grace recognized herself instantly standing between Ethan and Daniel. This is us, she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan nodded, almost imperceptibly. Grace felt her throat tighten. She didn't need to ask what it meant. The drawing was his way of saying what words could not, that she had found her place in his world, not by demanding it, but by earning it one quiet moment at a time. From that day, their bond deepened. Grace became the steady heartbeat in a house that had long been silent. And while the shadows of grief still lingered in its corners, the light she brought began to reach further each day, reminding both Ethan and Daniel that even in the aftermath of loss, love could grow again. In the early weeks after Grace Mitchell arrived, Daniel Carter found himself watching her with a mix of suspicion and discomfort. On the surface, her presence was unremarkable. She completed her tasks quietly, spoke to Ethan with calm respect, and never intruded on Daniel's private affairs. But beneath the calm exterior, Daniel saw something that stirred an unease he couldn't name. Ethan was beginning to look at Grace in a way he hadn't looked at his own father in months, with trust. That trust, instead of comforting Daniel, triggered a flicker of jealousy he didn't want to admit. He told himself it was natural. After all, he was Ethan's father. It was his role to be the one his son turned to, the one who could soothe the boy's fears and guide him through the darkness left by his mother's death. But the truth was, Daniel had failed at that role for months, and Grace was quietly filling the space he'd abandoned. The first crack in Daniel's guarded distance came one afternoon when the school called. Ethan had been in a fight. Daniel arrived to find his son in the principal's office, cheeks flushed with anger, a split lip, and eyes hard as stone. The principal explained that other children had mocked Ethan about his mother, and shockingly, about Grace calling her names that made Daniel's blood run cold. On the drive home, Ethan sat rigid and silent. Daniel, unsure how to reach him, clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. But when they arrived, it wasn't to Daniel that Ethan ran, it was to Grace. She knelt down, gently examined the split lip, and whispered something Daniel couldn't hear. Ethan's body, tense and bristling just moments before, softened. Watching that exchange was like a punch to Daniel's chest. The second turning point came a week later, on a quiet evening. Daniel heard the sharp crash. Before he saw it, the sound of glass shattering on hardwood. He rushed into the living room to find the framed photograph of Rachel, his late wife, in pieces on the floor. Ethan stood, frozen amid the shards, his face pale but defiant. "What have you done?" Daniel's voice thundered before he could stop himself. "That was your mother." Ethan didn't answer, but the hurt in his eyes was raw, almost unbearable to witness. Before the tension could boil over, Grace stepped in. She didn't scold or raise her voice. Instead, she moved to Ethan's side, placed a steady hand on his shoulder, and said softly, "I see your pain. It's okay to be angry. I'm here with you." Her words diffused the moment in a way Daniel hadn't thought possible. She coaxed Ethan into kneeling beside her to pick up the pieces, not just of the frame, but of something deeper. Daniel stood there, feeling powerless and strangely excluded, yet unable to deny that Grace had reached his son when he could not. That night, Daniel replayed the scene over and over in his mind. He had always thought of grief as something to be contained, managed quietly until it faded. But Grace seemed to understand that grief didn't vanish, it demanded to be acknowledged. Ethan's anger wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was the language of a child who didn't know how else to express loss. Over the next few days, Daniel began to notice the small ways Grace was helping Ethan heal. She never tried to erase Rachel's memory. In fact, she encouraged Ethan to talk about his mother, to remember the good moments. She created little rituals, a warm drink after school, quiet walks around the block, moments where she simply listened without rushing him to move on. Daniel's jealousy didn't disappear overnight. There were still moments when he would walk into a room and see Ethan leaning against Grace's arm, speaking in low tones, and feel that same pang in his chest. But alongside the jealousy was something else: relief. Relief that someone was finally reaching his son, keeping him from slipping further away. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Daniel confronted Grace in the kitchen. His voice was tight, his words edged with the vulnerability he hated showing. "I can't pretend I'm okay. With how close you've gotten to him. It feels like I'm losing him. Like he's slipping away into your world." Grace didn't flinch. "I'm not here to take your son away," she replied, her tone steady but not cold. "I'm here because he needs someone who doesn't turn away from his pain. You've been drowning in your own grief, Daniel, and Ethan's been left to fend for himself." Her words hit him harder than he expected. They weren't an attack, they were the truth. And in that moment, Daniel realized his fear wasn't really about Grace. It was about himself. About the gnawing worry that he couldn't be enough for his son, that he'd already failed him beyond repair. Grace's gaze softened. "He needs you, Daniel. But until you can be there for him, let me help hold him together." That night, Daniel lay awake thinking about her words. The image of Ethan clutching Grace's arm after the school fight returned to him, not as a threat, but as a lifeline his son had desperately needed. Grace wasn't replacing him. She was keeping Ethan's heart open long enough for Daniel to find his way back in. The next time Ethan had a nightmare, Daniel didn't hesitate. He found Grace already at his son's side, whispering reassurance. Instead of standing in the doorway, he stepped into the living room and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. The boy startled at first, then slowly relaxed. Grace met Daniel's eyes over the boy's head, and in that silent exchange, he understood. They were both in this together. It wasn't surrender, it was partnership. And for the first time since Rachel's death, Daniel felt a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the three of them could heal, not by replacing the past, but by building something strong enough to carry them into the future. The transformation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, after Grace Mitchell settled fully into the Carter household. There were no grand gestures or sweeping declarations, just small, consistent rituals that began to shape the rhythm of their days. She started with breakfast. It was nothing extravagant, just scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit laid out neatly each morning. But Grace insisted on one rule: they would sit together. At first, Ethan Carter would appear reluctantly, slumping into his chair with barely a word, his eyes fixed on the plate as if daring anyone to make conversation. Daniel Carter, unsure how to break the silence, often sipped his coffee in awkward quiet. Grace didn't push. She filled the stillness with gentle, almost casual comments about the weather, a funny headline she'd read, or the way the sunrise painted the garden in gold. Slowly, over the course of days, Ethan's muttered responses grew into short sentences. From breakfast, Grace introduced another ritual: afternoon walks. She would suggest a short loop around the block, sometimes coaxing Ethan with the promise of spotting the neighbor's new puppy, or picking a flower on the way home. Daniel, at first, didn't join them. He told himself he was too busy, buried in work. But one Saturday, without really deciding to, he found himself trailing behind them as they strolled down the tree-lined street. Grace walked at Ethan's pace, letting him stop to examine acorns or point out a bird's nest. Danielle noticed something startling: his son's shoulders weren't tense. His voice, though quiet, carried a hint of curiosity. The garden came next. Grace suggested they plant flowers together in a patch of earth that had been left untended since Rachel's death. Daniel hesitated, but Ethan surprised him by agreeing, though only if Grace was involved. That afternoon, the three of them knelt in the plastod dirt, hands deep in soil. Grace spoke about how each seed needed care, sunlight, and patience, her tone warm and steady. Ethan listened intently, even asking where each flower should go. Daniel realized she wasn't just teaching gardening, she was teaching something much deeper, that growth takes time, that love is an act of showing up consistently. It was during these moments that Daniel began to understand what he had been missing. His role as a father wasn't to command or instruct from a distance. It was to be present. Grace never once told him how to parent, but her actions spoke volumes. She looked Ethan in the eye when he spoke, never interrupting, never rushing him. She celebrated small victories. The first time Ethan shared a detail about his day without being asked, the rare moment he laughed at a silly joke. Daniel started making small changes of his own. Instead of disappearing into his office after dinner, he stayed in the living room, quietly reading while Ethan worked on homework. When Ethan got stuck, Daniel offered help without impatience. At first, the boy was wary, as if waiting for his father's attention to come with conditions. But slowly, that wariness eased. One night, when Ethan hesitated over a math problem, Daniel leaned in and said, "Let's figure it out together." The problem wasn't solved instantly, but the small smile Ethan gave him afterward felt like the bigger victory. Grace noticed the shift too. "You're listening more," she remarked one evening when they were alone in the kitchen. Daniel nodded, a little sheepishly. "I'm learning from you," he admitted. Their walks grew longer, their breakfasts livelier. In the garden, the first sprouts began to push through the soil, a quiet, living metaphor for the changes taking root inside the house. Ethan, who had once avoided eye contact, began looking at his father more often, as if testing the waters of trust. Daniel learned not to fill every silence with words, to let Ethan's thoughts come in their own time. One Saturday morning, as they were having breakfast, Ethan surprised them both by asking, "Can we go to the park today, all of us?" It was the first time he had suggested an outing that included his father. Daniel's answer was immediate. Of course. That afternoon, they kicked a soccer ball across the open field, Ethan's laughter carrying on the breeze. Grace stood to the proponess, sighed for a moment, watching the two of them, her smile soft but proud. Not every day was perfect. There were still moments when Ethan retreated, still times when grief shadowed his expression. But now, Daniel didn't see those moments as failures. He saw them as part of the process, signs that healing wasn't linear, but possible. The breakthrough came one evening in the garden. They were watering the flowers, setting sun casting long golden rays across the lawn. Ethan handed Daniel the watering can and said quietly, "Mom would have liked this." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of trust, of shared memory. Daniel swallowed hard, meeting his son's gaze. "I think she would have loved it," he replied. Grace watched from a few feet away, recognizing the significance of the exchange. She had been planting more than flowers. She had been planting the seeds of connection, watering them with patience and steady care. Daniel realized that too. In the past, he had thought love meant big gestures, providing the best of everything. Now he understood that for Ethan, love meant showing up, listening, and staying through the silences. That night, as they sat together in the living room, Ethan leaning lightly against his father, while Grace read aloud from a book, Daniel felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum to the past, it was becoming a home again. And though grief would always be a part of their story, so would these small, everyday rituals. In the soft glow of the lamp, with the faint scent of earth still on their hands, Daniel knew that they were not just healing Ethan, they were rebuilding a family. One breakfast, one walk, one planted seed at a time. It happened on a night when the wind howled against the Carter estate, like a restless spirit. Daniel Carter had been in his study, pretending to work, though his mind was far from the stack of papers in front of him. The silence of the house was suddenly pierced by the sound of hurried footsteps and a low, panicked whimper echoing down the hallway. He followed the noise, his chest tightening with dread, until he reached Ethan's room. The door was ajar, a sliver of warm lamplight spilling into the hall. Inside, Grace Mitchell knelt beside Ethan's bed, one hand clasping his trembling fingers, her voice weaving soft, steady words into the air. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe. I'm right here. Breathe with me, slow, like this." Ethan's face was pale, his eyes wide with the kind of fear Daniel recognized all too well. He had seen it in his own reflection after Rachel's funeral. His son's breaths came in shallow, bursts. His small body caught between waking and the nightmare that had gripped him. Grace never broke her calm rhythm, stroking his hair, speaking as if her voice alone could anchor him back to the present. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, guilt and gratitude warring inside him. He wanted to step in to take his son's hand, but part of him feared that Ethan would reject the gesture. For months, their connection had been frayed, each attempt at closeness met with walls of silence. But as he watched Grace slowly coax Ethan's breathing into steadiness, something inside him shifted. When Ethan's breathing finally evened out, and his eyelids fluttered closed, Grace stayed beside the bed for a moment longer, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice low. "Thank you for being here." Grace looked up at him, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "He needs someone who won't walk away when it's hard," she said simply. Her words were not an accusation, but they landed like one all the same. They left the room together, pulling the door shut behind them. In the hallway, the tension that had been simmering between them for weeks finally boiled over. Daniel leaned against the wall, his arms crossed as if holding himself together. "I'll admit it, I've been jealous. Watching him go to you instead of me. Feeling like you're taking my place." Grace didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to replace you, Daniel. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. You're his father. But right now, he's scared. And he needs both of us, if he's going to feel safe." Again. Her voice softened. "You've been drowning in your own grief. I understand that. But Ethan's been left to navigate his without you. I'm just holding the pieces until you're ready to take them back." Daniel's shoulders sagged, her words striking deeper than he expected. "And what if I'm never ready? What if I can't be the father he needs?" Grace stepped closer, her gaze steady. "Then you learn. You try. You stop thinking it has to be perfect, and you start showing up, even if it's messy." It was the first time he truly heard her, not as the woman he had hired, not as someone stepping into spaces he felt belonged to him, but as a partner in the most important fight of his life. "I don't know how to do this," Daniel admitted, his voice low. "Then we figure it out together," she replied. That night marked the beginning of a fragile truce. The next evening, when Ethan woke again from a nightmare, Grace was there as always, but this time, Daniel stepped into the room without hesitation. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. "I'm here, buddy," he murmured. Ethan's eyes flickered toward him, uncertain, but he didn't pull away. Grace glanced at Daniel, a quiet approval in her expression. From then on, they began to share the work of soothing Ethan's fears. Grace's steady voice would calm him, while Daniel's presence added a reassurance only a father could give. Slowly, Ethan began to accept Daniel's hand alongside Grace's. One evening, after Ethan had drifted back to sleep, Daniel and Grace sat in the kitchen with mugs of tea, the air between them no longer charged with suspicion. "I was wrong about you," Daniel said after a long silence. "I thought you were here to fill a role that was mine. But you've been doing something I couldn't, holding him together until I could find my way back." Grace smiled faintly. "You found your way faster than you think. Tonight, when you sat down with him, he didn't look away. That's a start." Daniel nodded, the tightness in his chest loosening just a little. "I want us to keep doing this together." From then on, they approached Ethan's care as a team. Morning breakfasts became warmer, less formal. In the afternoons, all three of them would walk in the garden, Grace letting Ethan chatter about the seedlings they'd planted, Daniel listening more than he spoke. At night, when shadows still frightened the boy, he no longer called just for Grace. He called for both of them. One night, as they stood outside Ethan's room after another successful calming, Daniel turned to Grace. "You were right," he said quietly. "It's not about who he runs to first. It's about making sure he never has to run alone." Grace's answering smile was soft but sure. Exactly. That shared understanding became the cornerstone of their new dynamic. The jealousy that had once gnawed at Daniel faded, replaced by a steady respect for the woman who had stepped into their lives and chosen to stay through the hardest moments. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: they were no longer walking it alone. For the first time since Rachel's death, Daniel felt that the pieces of his family, though still fragile, were slowly coming back together. Not because he had reclaimed his place, but because he had learned that love, in all its forms, was strongest when shared. The discovery happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when Daniel Carter found himself sifting through an old cedar chest, tucked away in the corner of his study. It had been untouched since Rachel's funeral, a box filled with memories he'd been too afraid to face. Dust coated the lid, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered as he lifted it open. Inside were photographs, worn ticket stubs from trips they'd taken, and, at the very bottom, an envelope yellowed with time. His name and Ethan's were written across it in Rachel's familiar, graceful handwriting. Daniel's hands trembled as he slid a finger under the flap, his breath catching when he unfolded the letter. The words inside were simple yet heavy with love. Each line a piece of her voice returned to him. She wrote of the life they had built together, the joy Ethan had brought them, and the hope she carried for their family's future, even if she could no longer be there. But it wasn't just a love letter. Rachel had filled the page with gentle wisdom, asking him to forgive not just others, but himself, for the mistakes that were bound to happen in life. She urged him to nurture Ethan's heart with patience, to be present through his grief, and to allow space for love to enter their lives again in whatever form it came. As Daniel read, tears blurred his vision. For months, he had carried the crushing weight of guilt for the nights he'd buried himself in work instead of sitting with his son, guilt for every sharp word spoken in frustration, guilt for letting grief build a wall between them. Yet, here, in Rachel's handwriting, was permission to let go of that burden. The final lines of her letter struck him deepest. If someone comes into Ethan's life who can help him feel safe and loved, let them in. Don't see it as losing your place, but as gaining someone who will help carry the weight with you. Family isn't just who we're born to, it's who we choose to hold on to. Daniel sat in silence for a long time, the letter open in his hands. His thoughts turned immediately to Grace Mitchell, to the countless quiet ways she had been there for Ethan, to the patience and tenderness she had shown without asking for anything in return. He realized then that his resistance toward her had not been about her at all. It had been about his own fear of being replaced. That evening, Daniel found Grace and Ethan in the living room. Ethan was curled up beside her, reading aloud from a book while Grace listened with a faint smile. The sight struck him with a mixture of grief and gratitude. He stepped forward, the letter still clutched in his hand. "I found something today," he said quietly, drawing their attention. Sitting down across from them, he began to read Rachel's words aloud. The room was hushed, except for his voice, each sentence carrying a piece of Rachel back into their lives. Ethan's eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears, while Grace's expression softened into quiet understanding. When he finished, Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it on the coffee table. "She wanted us to know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that love doesn't end, that it can grow in new ways if we let it." He looked directly at Grace. "I think she was talking about you." Grace's eyes shimmered, but she said nothing, simply reaching out to squeeze his hand. Ethan leaned into her side, his small gesture speaking louder than any words. In that moment, Daniel felt the shift. Rachel's letter had not only given him permission to accept Grace into their family, it had made him realize that doing so was an act of love for both his son and himself. For the first time in a long while, he believed they could build something whole again, not by replacing what was lost, but by embracing the love still standing in front of them. The afternoon light streamed gently through the wide living room windows, casting a warm glow over the carpet where Ethan Carter sat cross-legged, crayons scattered around him. For weeks, he had been slowly emerging from the shell grief had built around him, but today there was something different in the way his small hands moved across the paper, steady, deliberate, almost hopeful. Daniel Carter watched from the doorway, curious but not wanting to interrupt. When Ethan finally looked up, his cheeks flushed with quiet pride, he held out the drawing to Grace Mitchell. She took it carefully, her eyes widening as she studied the simple yet striking image. 3 figures. Ethan in the middle, holding hands with Daniel on one side and Grace on the other. All 3 were smiling under a bright yellow sun. The colors were bold, the lines uneven, but the meaning was crystal clear. Daniel stepped closer, his throat tightening. "Is this us?" he asked softly. Ethan nodded, the smallest of smiles playing on his lips. It wasn't just a picture, it was a declaration. In his own quiet way, Ethan was telling them that the walls between them had begun to fall, that he could imagine a world where they were not just surviving together, but belonging together. Grace's voice was gentle. "It's beautiful, Ethan. Thank you for letting us be part of your picture." Her words were light, but her eyes shimmered, understanding the depth of what the plisome boy was offering. Daniel knelt beside his son, looking him in the eyes. "You know," he said, his voice low, but steady, "a family isn't just about who you're born to. It's about who's there for you, no matter what. And Grace, she's family." The statement hung in the air, more profound than Daniel expected. Grace blinked, clearly, moved, and Ethan's small hand reached out to grip hers tightly. Daniel placed his hand over both of theirs, sealing the moment in quiet solidarity. They framed the drawing that evening, and hung it in the living room, where it would serve as a reminder, not of perfection, but of possibility. It was proof that healing didn't come all at once. It came in small steps, in moments of trust, in the courage to see each other not through the lens of loss, but through the promise of what they could build together. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt certain about the road ahead. They weren't just three people sharing a house anymore. They were, in every way that mattered, a family. The Carter estate had not heard laughter like this in years. Balloons swayed gently from the high ceilings, the scent of vanilla cake filled the air, and the sound of children's voices echoed through rooms that had once felt cold and hollow. Ethan Carter's 8th birthday wasn't just a celebration of age. It was a celebration of survival, of a family reborn. In the corner, Daniel Carter watched as his son darted between friends, cheeks flushed with joy. Beside him, Grace Mitchell adjusted the last platter on the table, her calm smile reflecting the peace she had helped bring into their lives. The home, once heavy with grief, now pulsed with warmth. It had taken months of patience, unspoken forgiveness, and the courage to face what hurt most, but they had arrived here together. When the candles were lit, Ethan closed his eyes, making a wish only he knew, and blew them out in one breath. In that moment, Daniel understood, this was their new beginning, not defined by what they had lost, but by the love that remained. Healing doesn't happen in a single day. It's built in the quiet moments when we choose to stay, to listen, and to love, even when it's hard. Family is not just who we're born to, but who stands beside us when life falls apart. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment about what family means to you, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so we can share more stories that remind us all of the power of love, hope, and second chances.